How's it going, Starseekers? My name's Gotcake, and in this review we're going to be taking a look at Panzer Paladin, an action platformer where you play as a pilot called Flame, who, assisted by a mech called Grit, is tasked with destroying powerful monsters which now inhabit various countries across the globe. So hitting the main menu and checking out the options, we get some standard language and audio settings, and we also get a display filler allowing us to turn on some 4 CRT visuals for that extra kick of nostalgia. We're also able to rebind the game's controls to suit our liking. Now before we get into the main game, we can check out the blacksmith mode, where we're able to craft our own weapons via an easy to use pixel designer tool. We can then spend 32 points to allocate various attributes to the weapon before saving it. Our own created weapons and other players' weapons will then appear in game after we encounter the horsemen in each level. So getting into the main game, first we have to make our way through the tutorial level, which teaches us the basics and introduces us to the game's story, which revolves around a bunch of weapons falling from a strange spaceship to Earth. Now I won't go into detail, but the story in general is pretty cliche, and it doesn't really offer anything original, but it does contain some nice pixel art to satisfy your eyeballs with. Following the completion of the tutorial, we then gain access to the map screen, where we can play any of the game's first 10 stages in any order. We also gain access to the laboratory, where we can donate weapons to gain spirit points and upgrade Grit. I personally found this to be pretty disappointing though, as each upgrade just increased Grit's health by a small amount, and you're limited to 5 upgrades in your first playthrough. So throughout the majority of levels we take control of Grit, with Flame safely nestled away inside him. I found the game's controls to be pretty fluid, though the jumping mechanics can feel a little stiff at times. So we can attack with the Y button, and we have a shield which can defend against projectiles. Now defeated enemies in the game often drop weapons which Grit can wield when collected, and it's Panzer Paladin's unique weapon mechanics which separate it from other action platformers. The game boasts a huge variety of weapons in various shapes and sizes, and just like crafted weapons, they each have different stats such as damage, attack speed and durability. Each weapon also comes as a piercing, cutting or impact weapon, which apparently deal more damage to specific enemies, though I can't say that I really noticed the difference. Now Grit can only wield 4 weapons at once, and any additional weapons we collect get stored in our inventory, though we can swap them out anytime we like. The more weapons we have stored, the greater our burden, and once we hit high burden, the horseman who we encounter halfway through levels will attack us. Now these fights aren't difficult once you get the mechanics down, and it does become a little monotonous as it basically ends up being in every single level after we get about halfway through the game. Now weapons will break when the durability, seen as a bar in the top right, reaches 0. But each weapon also comes with a spell, and we can sacrifice weapons early to activate these spells by holding ZL and ZR together. And spells fall into 3 main categories. We have healing spells which heal Grit for various amounts of health or remove curses from him, buffs which can deflect projectiles or increase our defense and attack, which is extremely useful for boss fights. And finally we have what I would term utility spells, and these include spells such as lightning or burst spells which deal damage to enemies, wings which allow you to continuously jump and can be extremely powerful against certain bosses, or the beam spell which allows you to fire balls of energy from your weapon. So Grit also has a few techniques he can use both in combat and to traverse through levels. He has an upward thrust which hits enemies above him and essentially works as a double jump to reach higher platforms, and a downward thrust which is similar to the one found in Shovel Knight, which allows us to damage and bounce off enemies. Now many of the enemies in the game have very simple attack patterns or wander back and forth aimlessly, but there are quite a few that you'll encounter that put up more of a fight. For these you'll have to time your attacks and use Grit's dodge to quickly dash out of the way of attacks, and you can also parry their attacks if you time your own attack just as the enemy hits your shield, which usually stuns enemies, giving you time to get some free hits in. So each level in the game features 2 checkpoints which you need to sacrifice weapons to activate. And there are also sections which require Flame to eject from Grit and tackle on her own. Armed with a whip, reminiscent of that found in the Castlevania games, which you can use to attack enemies and swing across gaps. After completing Flame's section, she can then top up Grit's health by whipping these energy containers, and then teleport Grit to her using these pads before continuing onwards. Now Flame's able to hop in and out of Grit anytime she wants. Many levels contain secret areas which are only accessible with Flame, and these usually contain additional lives. Now losing all of Grit's health will automatically eject Flame from him, and you'll have to find an energy pod and teleporter to revive him. Flame only has a tiny health bar, and losing all of her health will send you back to the latest checkpoint, and losing all your lives simply means you've got to start the level from the beginning again. Now at the end of each level you'll face its boss or weapon keeper, which is usually themed around a mythical creature from that particular region. Each boss fight is unique with some decent variety to boss mechanics, and I found that most of them provided a decent challenge, though I was able to cheese a couple of them using wings. After defeating a boss it'll drop a unique weapon, which other than appearance doesn't really have anything to distinguish it from standard weapons. Now level design in the game is pretty good, and there's a decent mixture between horizontal and vertical platforming sections, and several sections unique to different levels, but I do need to criticise how levels play out. Now let me explain what I mean by this. You begin a level by working through some easier enemies and platforming, then you get to a section that you have to navigate with Flame before jumping back into Grit for a save point and a battle with a horseman. Following this you work through another harder platforming section before hitting another checkpoint just before you fight the boss. Whilst levels themselves provide some uniqueness, this same formula is used on every single level in the game, and I just think it would have been nice to see a bit more variation to each level's mechanics. Now the game features 3 difficulty levels, and this affects the appearance of additional hazards and enemies in levels, though I didn't find a huge difference between easy and hard modes. Levels in general weren't overly challenging and difficulty was consistent for the most part, but there's a definite spike in difficulty in the last few levels, even on easy. Fans of old school platforming will likely find this more to the taste, but if like me you're pretty shy at platforming games, then you'll likely find these last few levels to be incredibly frustrating. Now focusing on the game's visuals, I thought the game's pixel art was outstanding, and each level was beautifully detailed and distinctly different in appearance, matching the theme of each country. The game's bosses and enemies also looked pretty good, and though each level did have a couple of enemies unique to them, it was a little disappointing to see that many enemies were repeated in several stages, with the change in colour being the only difference. The game's soundtrack is also pretty great, with a glorious combination of chiptune, rock and metal. And performance wise I had no issues, with the game playing fine in both handheld and docked mode. Now the main game contains a decent amount of content which took me over 10 hours to work through including recording time, and after completing the game once you unlock 2 new modes which provide plenty of extra content. The first of these is Remix mode, where you can replay the whole game again, working your way through more difficult remixed versions of levels which include a bunch of new features, more challenging enemies and an alternate ending, and you also get to keep all of your weapons and upgrades. There's also a speedrun mode where you can play through each level and try and complete them as fast as possible. You can then compare your speed against other people with the online leaderboards. And finally there's tournament mode, which is essentially boss rush with a twist. Here you get to fight through each of the game's bosses one after another, and you're rewarded with additional points for beating bosses faster or for not taking any hits. Tournament mode also has online leaderboards. So on the whole, my gameplay experience with Panzer Paladin was a very positive one, and I'd say it's one of the best platformers I've played since Shovel Knight, though it could have done with a bit more variation to the level formula, and I feel like the first 10 levels of the game don't prepare you for the difficulty spike in the last 5 levels, which casual gamers may find a little too challenging. So now it's time to rate the game. Now I rate games between 1 and 5 stars, with a shovelware stamp of approval reserved for the worst games on the eShop. This rating is based on my own personal opinion on what games have to offer in terms of gameplay and value for money to potential buyers. And for a rating I'd give Panzer Paladin 4 out of 5 stars. It's clear that a lot of work has gone into the game and its fantastic visuals, and I feel like there's enough content on offer to justify the higher price point for the game. You can get the game from the UK Switch eStore for £16 or from the US eStore for $19.99. Alternatively, the game's also available on Steam. How's it going, Starseekers? I hope you enjoyed this review, and if you did, hit that like button and drop your thoughts in the comments section below. As always, hit that subscribe button to support the channel, and jump onto the Starseekers Discord to get involved with the growing community. For now though, I just want to thank you all once again for watching, and until next time, game on.